Imagine this for a moment. A book appears today. It claims to be written by an all-powerful being. It contradicts itself. It borrows older myths. It demands obedience. And it promises punishment if you doubt it. Now ask yourself honestly, if this book were released today, would you believe it? Or would you call it what we usually call things like that now? A cult manifesto, a political tool, or a psychological experiment? Because here's the uncomfortable question hiding behind faith. Do we believe the Bible because it's true, or because it was written before we learned how to question? And once you see that distinction, everything starts to shift. The power of timing. Timing changes everything, not just in history, but in how the human mind decides what feels true. A message never exists on its own. It lands inside a cultural atmosphere, shaped by fear, knowledge, and limitations. 2,000 years ago, people lived in a world without science, without global communication, without any shared method for testing reality. Illness had no explanation beyond spirits or curses. Storms were not weather systems but divine moods. Survival depended on obedience to authority, and authority was inherited, not questioned. In that world, a voice claiming divine origin did not sound suspicious. It sounded comforting. It offered structure in chaos and intention in randomness. When crops failed or children died, a story that explained suffering as part of a higher plan was not irrational. It was stabilizing. Belief functioned less as truth-seeking and more as emotional survival. Now shift the setting. Imagine the same claim made today. Someone says God speaks only to them and has entrusted them with absolute truth. The claim itself has not changed, but everything around it has. We now live in a world trained to ask how and why. We test before we trust. We measure before we submit. We do not build cathedrals for exclusive revelations. We schedule evaluations. Not because we are cruel, but because we have learned that extraordinary claims collapse without verification. This contrast exposes something uncomfortable. The credibility of belief often has less to do with truth and more to do with timing. The same story that once unified civilizations now triggers skepticism. Not because humans became hostile to meaning, but because we gained tools to detect patterns, biases, and manipulation. When explanations improve, mysteries lose their grip. So maybe belief is not a fixed response to reality. Maybe it is a moving response to uncertainty. When answers are scarce, stories become sacred. When answers multiply, stories become symbolic or suspect. That does not automatically make ancient belief foolish, but it does make blind loyalty questionable. Once you see how deeply timing shapes what we accept as divine, a new question quietly emerges. How many beliefs survive not because they are true, but because they arrived before we learned how to question them? And once that question settles in, it becomes very hard to unsee what else timing may have disguised. Miracles in the age of cameras. In the Bible, miracles are not rare events. They are constant, dramatic, and public. Seas open on command. Food appears from nothing. The dead return to life as witnesses watch in awe. These moments are not treated as anomalies, but as proof. Proof that a divine hand is actively intervening in the world. For ancient audiences, this made sense. There were no controlled experiments, no peer review, no shared standard for verifying extraordinary claims. Testimony was enough. If enough people said it happened, it effectively did. Now place that same pattern into the modern world. Today, nearly every human carries a camera. Every unusual event is filmed from multiple angles. Every claim is slowed down, zoomed in, and analyzed by millions of strangers within hours. Reality has become recordable. Memory no longer carries the same authority it once did. Evidence has replaced testimony as the currency of belief. Imagine someone announcing a resurrection today, not quietly, not symbolically, but publicly, as an undeniable miracle. The response would not be worship, it would be requests. Footage from multiple sources, medical documentation, death certificates, independent verification from people with nothing to gain. Faith would not be rejected, but it would be suspended until proof arrived. This shift reveals something subtle but profound. Faith once thrived in the absence of evidence. It filled the gaps where understanding failed. Today, absence of evidence creates suspicion rather than wonder. When claims leave no trace in a world designed to capture everything, the silence becomes loud. So ask yourself this without defensiveness. If miracles were once common, public, and transformative, why did they fade precisely as our ability to document reality improved? Why do divine interventions now happen mostly in private, in visions, in stories that resist verification? The pattern is difficult to ignore. This does not automatically mean miracles never happened, but it does force a harder question. Are miracles disappearing, or are they being outpaced by our ability to test them? And if belief depends on events that only occur beyond scrutiny, what does that say about the foundation of those beliefs? That is where the tension truly begins. A God that sounds strangely human. Read the Bible carefully, but not devotionally and not defensively. Read it psychologically, as if you were analyzing a character rather than worshiping an authority. When you do that, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. God gets angry, God becomes jealous, God feels offended, God demands constant recognition and praise. These reactions are not subtle. They are repeated, intense, and often framed as moral justification for punishment. But pause and consider this. These are not cosmic traits, they are human ones. Anger emerges from frustration, jealousy emerges from insecurity, obsession with praise emerges from the need for validation. These emotions make sense in social hierarchies, in fragile power structures, and in rulers who fear losing control. They make far less sense in a timeless, all-knowing intelligence that lacks nothing and cannot be threatened. A truly infinite mind would not argue with its creations. It would not negotiate loyalty. It would not punish doubt as betrayal. It would not demand worship to feel complete. Such behavior would be unnecessary. And yet, that is exactly how the biblical God is portrayed. Not distant and serene, but reactive. Not above human emotion, but deeply immersed in it. This raises a disturbing possibility that many are taught never to explore. What if this is not humanity created in God's image, but God created in humanity's psychological image? What if the traits assigned to the divine are reflections of the fears, desires, and power dynamics of the people who wrote the stories? A God who mirrors the ruler of the time, a God who enforces obedience, a God who justifies violence when authority is challenged. Once you notice this, the tone of the text shifts. The voice behind the commands begins to sound less like an eternal source of wisdom and more like a familiar human voice. A voice concerned with control. A voice that reacts when questioned. A voice that demands loyalty not through clarity, but through fear. And when that recognition settles in, it becomes difficult to read the text the same way again. Morality that didn't age well. If the Bible were written today, it would not be praised as a moral breakthrough. It would be challenged, questioned, in many places, rejected. Not because modern people are hostile to morality, but because the moral framework inside the text no longer meets the standards we now consider basic decency. The Bible tolerates slavery and regulates it rather than condemning it. It treats women as property, valued through obedience and fertility. It punishes thought by framing doubt as sin. It consistently rewards submission over compassion. We do not call that divine today, we call it unethical. And that shift in language matters because it reveals that our moral compass has moved forward while the text has remained fixed. Yet believers are taught to claim that God is timeless and unchanging. That moral truth was fully revealed thousands of years ago. This is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. If morality were truly timeless, it would not require constant reinterpretation to remain acceptable. But history shows the opposite. Moral progress happens when humans challenge Scripture, not when they submit to it. Slavery was not abolished because people read the Bible more carefully. It was abolished because people read it critically and chose empathy over obedience. The same is true for women's rights, civil rights, and freedom of belief. This suggests something deeply unsettling for traditional faith. Maybe morality does not flow downward from holy books. Maybe it grows outward from human experience, from suffering recognized, from injustice witnessed, from empathy expanding beyond tribal boundaries. Scriptures often follow this progress later, through reinterpretation, metaphor, and selective emphasis. If that is true, then belief begins to change shape. It stops looking like access to eternal truth and starts looking like inheritance. A moral framework passed down, protected by tradition, and updated only when human conscience demands it. And once belief is seen this way, its authority feels less sacred and more historical, rooted not in divine perfection, but in humanity's slow and painful evolution toward compassion. The psychology of belief. People rarely believe because the evidence demands it. They believe because something inside them needs it. Fear of death, fear of chaos, fear of being alone in a vast and indifferent universe. Belief offers relief from that pressure. It gives shape to uncertainty and turns anxiety into purpose. This is not a flaw in human nature. It is how the mind protects itself. The Bible does not only offer meaning, it offers certainty. It tells you who is right and who is wrong, who is saved and who is lost. It provides a clear enemy, a clear purpose, and a clear punishment for doubt. In a confusing world, certainty feels like safety. Ambiguity feels like danger. So, belief becomes less about truth and more about emotional shelter. This is not theology, it is psychology. Modern psychology understands how powerful identity-based belief can be. When a belief becomes part of who you are, questioning it feels like self-destruction. Doubt stops being intellectual and becomes personal. That is why challenges to belief are often met with anger rather than curiosity. The threat is not to an idea, but to a sense of self. If the Bible appeared today, psychologists would not approach it as divine revelation. They would approach it as a system. They would study why it works, who it comforts, and under what conditions it spreads most effectively. They would ask what fears it soothes and which anxieties it amplifies. They would examine how guilt, reward, and belonging are woven together to reinforce loyalty. Once belief is framed this way, something shifts. Faith stops feeling mysterious or supernatural. It starts to feel constructed, designed to stabilize groups, maintain cohesion, and discourage deviation. This does not mean believers are foolish. It means they are human. But it does mean belief is no longer untouchable. It becomes something that can be examined, understood, and, if necessary, questioned without fear. Why we trust ancient words more than new ones. Here is the strange part that rarely gets questioned. The older a claim is, the more authority we automatically give it. Time itself becomes a kind of shield. If someone wrote the Bible today, every line would be scrutinized, motives would be questioned, sources would be traced, contradictions would be highlighted. But because the text is ancient, we treat it as fragile, something to be protected rather than examined. Age quietly turns into authority. Longevity starts to feel like validation, but age does not equal truth. Age only equals survival. A belief system that lasts for centuries is not necessarily correct. It is simply one that managed to persist. That persistence can come from power, from force, from social pressure, or from being embedded so deeply into daily life that questioning it becomes costly. History makes this clear. Thousands of religions once existed. Each had creation stories, moral codes, divine laws, and promised rewards. Most of them are gone. Not because they were disproven, but because they lost influence, territory, or followers. Their gods did not fade because they were false. They faded because their stories stopped spreading. The surviving religions did not win a truth competition. They won a distribution competition. They aligned with empires. They integrated into law. They were taught to children before critical thinking developed. Over time, familiarity turned into reverence. Reverence turned into immunity from criticism. This creates a powerful illusion. We assume that if a belief has lasted this long, it must contain something uniquely true. But longevity only tells us that it adapted well to human psychology and social structures. It tells us it was good at replicating itself. That is a very different skill from being accurate. Once you see this, the pedestal begins to wobble. Ancient words stop feeling sacred simply because they are old. They start to look like survivors of a long and brutal cultural filtering process. Many ideas entered history. Few remained. The ones that stayed are not necessarily the best. They are the ones that spread most effectively and resisted replacement. That realization does not demand rejection, but it does demand humility. It asks us to stop confusing endurance with truth and tradition with authority. And when that distinction becomes clear, ancient words lose their untouchable status. They become what all ideas should be: open to examination, open to challenge, and no longer protected by age alone. What would happen if it dropped today? Let's be honest about how this would actually unfold. If a text identical to the Bible appeared today, claiming divine authorship and absolute authority, it would not be met with quiet reverence. It would be flagged almost immediately. Scholars would dissect it, journalists would investigate it, online communities would debunk it line by line. Others would parody it, remix it, and turn its most dramatic passages into memes within hours. For a brief moment, it would dominate attention. Headlines would explode. Think pieces would multiply. Debates would rage across every platform. Then, just as quickly, the momentum would fade. It would not become sacred. It would become content. Another claim processed by the modern attention economy and moved aside once the questions outweighed the answers. This would not happen because people are cruel or closed-minded. It would happen because belief now requires justification. Authority is no longer granted by assertion alone. Claims must earn trust. They must survive scrutiny, contradiction, and competing explanations. A text that demands obedience without evidence would struggle to hold attention once the novelty wore off. This exposes the real issue, and it is not about whether people today are less spiritual or more cynical. The real question is whether belief systems can survive in an environment where individuals are allowed, and even encouraged, to think freely. Where doubt is not punished, and questioning is not framed as moral failure. That kind of freedom is dangerous to institutions built on certainty. Systems that rely on inherited belief depend on early acceptance and limited exposure to alternatives. When people encounter many worldviews side by side, exclusivity weakens. When ideas must compete openly, authority loses its automatic grip. That is why this question creates unease. It is not just about religion, it is about control. A belief that cannot withstand open examination must rely on insulation rather than persuasion. And once people realize they are allowed to question without fear, the foundation many institutions rest on begins to shake. What this means for you. If the Bible were written today, belief would not arrive pre-installed. It would not be assumed. It would not be inherited before you could speak. Belief would be optional. Something you could approach, examine, and walk away from without social consequence. That single difference changes everything. This leads to a quiet truth many people were never told. Faith survives best in environments where questioning is discouraged and alternatives are limited. When belief is framed as virtue and doubt as failure, acceptance becomes automatic. Over time, belief stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like reality itself. But there is a moment that breaks that spell. It is a simple question, but it carries weight. Would I believe this if I were not born into it, not raised with it, not surrounded by people who assume it is true? That question does not attack belief. It places it in neutral ground. The moment you ask it, something shifts internally. You step out of inheritance and into agency. You stop defending a position you did not consciously choose. You begin evaluating ideas based on coherence, evidence, and moral alignment rather than loyalty. This is where autonomy returns, not the loud kind that rebels for attention, but the quiet kind that thinks independently. Autonomy does not require rejecting everything you were taught. It requires permission to examine it honestly, to keep what holds up and release what does not. Once belief becomes optional, it loses its power to control through fear. Meaning does not disappear, but it becomes self-directed. Values are no longer enforced by threat, but chosen through reflection. That shift is subtle, but it is profound. It marks the difference between living inside a belief system and consciously deciding how you understand the world. And once that autonomy is reclaimed, it does not easily go away. This isn't about mocking belief, and it's not about replacing one certainty with another. It's about recognizing how deeply timing, fear, and tradition shape what we call truth. If the Bible were written today, belief would require evidence, explanation, accountability. And maybe that's the real lesson. Not that ancient books are false, but that unquestioned belief is fragile. Progress doesn't come from destroying old stories. It comes from refusing to let them think for us. So keep asking, keep noticing contradictions, Keep choosing curiosity over comfort. And if you value truth more than tradition, stay here, subscribe, and don't stop thinking.